The morning they told Lieutenant Soren Aldgate that a woman would be joining his advanced reconnaissance course. He set down his coffee, looked at the officer who delivered the message, and said nothing for a long time. That silence said everything. Her name was Petra Linwood. She was 29 years old, 5'6", and she had qualified for the Army's Special Operations Aviation Regiment selection course 3 times before anyone in that building had ever heard of her. She had grown up in Billings, Montana, the daughter of a cattle rancher, who happened to also be a former Marine sniper. Her father, Staff Sergeant Gerald Linwood, retired, had taught her to read wind at age 11. He had taught her to hold her breath at age 12. He had taught her that distance was not an obstacle. Distance was a variable, and variables could be solved. None of that was in the briefing packet that sat on Aldgate's desk. What the packet said was, Specialist Linwood, female, transferred from 160th SOAR Support Unit, qualified marksman. Application approved by Colonel Harwick, Joint Special Operations Command. Aldgate had read it twice. Then he had folded it in half and placed it under a coffee mug. There were 11 men in the course that cycle. Veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, 2 of them. Men who had done the kind of work that didn't appear on any public record. A former Ranger, Sergeant First Class Dunmore, who had shot his way out of a compound outside Mosul with a broken arm and a pistol. A signal specialist, Corporal Fenn, who had cross-trained in precision marksmanship at Fort Bragg and finished in the top 3 of his cohort. And then there was Staff Sergeant Tolliver, who had been telling the same story about Helmand Province for 4 years and showed no signs of stopping. Linwood arrived on a Wednesday. She did not arrive the way some people arrive, with noise, with the need to be noticed. She arrived the way weather arrives, quietly and then all at once. She was in the back of the transport van, kit bag between her boots, reading a worn paperback that nobody could identify from a distance. When the van doors opened, she stepped out, looked at the building, and walked toward the entrance without asking which door to use. Dunmore watched her from the motor pool. He said nothing out loud. He didn't need to. The way he looked at Fenn was its own sentence. The first week was administrative, orientation, equipment check, range familiarization. Linwood performed each task quietly and without error. She did not seek conversation and she did not avoid it. When Tolliver asked her where she'd come from, she said, Montana originally, and then turned back to her field manual. Tolliver looked at Dunmore. Dunmore looked at the ceiling. It was on the 3rd day that the first thing happened. The course required a preliminary rifle qualification at 800 meters. Standard military qualification called for a score of 36 out of 40 to pass. Aldgate had set the internal course standard at 38. Only 2 men in the previous cycle had hit it. The record for the range was held by a former Delta candidate, a score that nobody had matched in 3 years. Linwood shot 40 out of 40. She did it on a crosswind day. She did it with a rifle that had been assigned to her the morning of the qualification, not zeroed to her specifications, not adjusted. She had 40 minutes with it before the event began. Later, Corporal Fenn would say he'd seen her at the range at 5 in the morning, when the range was technically closed, but there was no official record of that, and Fenn never made it official. Aldgate looked at the scoring sheet for a long time. Then he called her into his office and told her the score would be noted, but that the preliminary qualification was not a reflection of final course performance. He told her that precision, shooting under static conditions, was only a fraction of what the course demanded. He told her, in the tone of a man who believes he is being reasonable, that early high performance sometimes indicated poor long-term judgment, a tendency to peak too soon, to prioritize the measurable over the sustainable. Linwood sat across from him and listened to all of it. Then she said, I understand, sir. Is there anything else? There wasn't. She walked out and did not mention the conversation to anyone. Dunmore found out about it anyway, the way information always moves through small units. Sideways, without an official pathway. He told Fenn. Fenn told Tolliver. By evening, everyone in the course knew that Linwood had shot a perfect score and been called into the lieutenant's office. Immediately afterward, nobody said anything directly. But the air in the barracks changed. The next phase was stalking. For those unfamiliar with the discipline, stalking is the art of moving through terrain without being detected, not just visually, but audibly, thermally, in terms of shadow and scent, and the way long grass moves when a body passes through it. A trained observer, given enough time and the right conditions, can detect a poorly executed approach from several hundred meters. The best snipers move like weather, like changes in pressure, like the kind of thing you notice only after it has already passed through. Linwood had grown up in the mountains of Montana. She had been hunting with her father since before she was old enough for the ammunition to leave a proper mark on her shoulder. She knew how grass moved. She knew how wind direction changed near ridgelines. She knew that the human eye is drawn to motion and that the trick was not to stop moving, but to move the way things move that are not human. The stalking exercise took place over 2 days. Participants were given a designated final firing position and a starting point 800 meters behind it. Between them was open terrain, scrub brush, one dry creek bed, and 2 trained instructors with binoculars whose sole job was to detect and mark anyone they spotted. On the first day, 7 of the 11 men were marked. Linwood was not among them. She reached her final firing position at 14 minutes past the designated time window, which should have been a demerit. But when the course instructor walked to her position to mark her late, he found she had been there for 6 minutes already. She had arrived early and gone still. The clay marker she'd placed at the edge of her hide indicated she'd been in position before the final window opened. The instructor, a hard-faced warrant officer named Peck, stood over her for a long moment. He said, "How long have you been here?" She said, 16 minutes, sir." Peck looked at her, looked at the marker, looked at the open terrain she had crossed without being detected. He walked back to the observation post without saying another word. That evening, Aldgate reviewed the exercise reports. He called Peck into his office. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. Nobody was present for it, but afterward, Peck went directly to the range and stood there alone for a while, which he did not usually do. The course moved forward. There was a land navigation exercise. There was a stress inoculation phase that involved 48 hours without sleep, a series of physical standards, and what the Army politely called simulated hostile questioning. Linwood performed at or above standard in every measured category. And then came the evaluation board. The evaluation board was where the course got complicated, not because the standards were unclear, but because the application of standards had historically involved a certain amount of human judgment. In military contexts, human judgment is supposed to be trained and calibrated and subject to oversight. In practice, it was also subject to the kind of bias that doesn't declare itself openly, but shows up in the language people use when they think they're being objective. There were 3 evaluators. Aldgate was one of them. A major named Corbin, who had come up from Fort Leavenworth for the board cycle, was another. The third was a command sergeant major named Fitch, who had been in the Army for 27 years and had a reputation for being the kind of man who could not be persuaded of anything he hadn't already decided. The board evaluated each candidate on 7 criteria. 3 were objective: physical standards, qualification scores, tactical proficiency marks. 4 were subjective: leadership potential, unit cohesion contribution, adaptability assessment, and what the rubric called command presence. Linwood's objective scores were the highest in the cohort. In 2 of the 3 objective categories, she had the highest marks the course had recorded in the current training year. Her subjective scores were a different matter. Fitch gave her a 2 out of 5 on command presence. When asked to explain his rationale in writing, he wrote, "Contingent Linwood demonstrates technical proficiency, but has not shown the interpersonal assertiveness expected of personnel operating in high-pressure advisory roles. Quiet demeanor may not translate under field conditions requiring immediate team rapport." Corbin gave her a 3 out of 5 on leadership potential, noting some uncertainty about performance in decentralized command environments. Aldgate gave her a 3 out of 5 on unit cohesion. He wrote, "Candidian's integration with cohort has been functional but limited. Insufficient evidence of peer mentoring or proactive group contribution." Linwood's cumulative score placed her 6th in the cohort. Dunmore was 1st. Fenn was 3rd. She was notified of her ranking on a Thursday morning by email with no accompanying explanation. She read the email twice. Then she closed her laptop and sat for a moment, looking at the wall. There was a version of this story where she accepted the result and moved forward. In a different version, she would be angry, loudly, publicly, in a way that could be reported and managed and used as confirmation of whatever the evaluators already believed. The thing about institutional bias is that it is designed, whether intentionally or not, to produce exactly one of those 2 outcomes: silence or excess. Neither one changes anything. Linwood chose a formal inquiry. The inquiry was 2 pages long. It was written in the tone of a staff officer's memorandum, Precise, unemotional, procedurally exact. It did not accuse anyone of bias. It did not use the word discrimination. It asked, in the language of the Army's own evaluation standards, a series of specific questions about the criteria used to assess her subjective scores. On command presence, the evaluation rubric defines command presence as the ability to communicate intent, establish authority in ambiguous situations, and maintain composure under stress. Could the evaluating board provide specific instances in which my performance failed to meet these criteria with reference to observed behavior during the assessment period? On unit cohesion, the rubric defines peer contribution in terms of task-relevant support and collaborative performance. Could the board specify which observed interactions led to a limited cohesion assessment, given that no formal cohesion incidents were recorded during my training cycle? On leadership potential, the rubric notes that decentralized command performance should be evaluated based on observed decision-making during the land navigation exercise, the small unit tactical problem on day 14, and the stress inoculation phase. My performance in each of these was scored above average by the course instructors. Could the evaluating board clarify which specific behaviors or absences of behavior led to the uncertainty noted in the assessment? She submitted it on a Friday afternoon through the official administrative channel with a copy to the JAG office as a procedural notification. On Monday morning, Aldgate had not yet responded. On Tuesday, Colonel Harwick called Aldgate's office. Harwick was not the kind of officer who called without reason. He was 61 years old and had been in special operations long enough to have seen 5 iterations of the Army's gender integration debate, each of which had produced the same cycle of resistance, argument, and eventual acknowledgement that the women who persisted had in fact been right. He was not a crusader. He was not a reformer. He was a man who had watched the same play performed too many times and had stopped finding the ending surprising. He asked Aldgate a simple question. Had the board's subjective criteria been applied consistently across all candidates? Aldgate said that the process had followed established protocol. Harwick said he was glad to hear it and that he'd like the evaluation documentation for all 11 candidates transmitted to his office by end of day Wednesday. Aldgate said that was possible. Harwick said he knew it was. The documentation was transmitted. What Harwick found in it was not evidence of conspiracy or deliberate wrongdoing, which would have been simpler to address. What he found was the shape of an assumption, visible only in aggregate, only when you laid 11 evaluations side by side and read the language used for each. The men described as quiet were assessed as steady under pressure. Linwood's identical quality was assessed as limited in peer rapport. A candidate who had spoken over his teammates during the small unit tactical problem was described as showing natural leadership initiative. A candidate who had waited, assessed the terrain, and made the correct call in silence was described as showing insufficient command presence. The shape of an assumption, that was all it was. And that shape, applied 7 times across 4 subjective criteria, had moved Linwood from first in the cohort to 6th. Harwick did not call a hearing. He did not issue a public finding. He called Aldgate back and told him that the board would reconvene for a supplementary evaluation, a single event, designed to produce 1 additional data point for the subjective criteria. The event was a command problem, a simulated scenario in which a small team faced an unexpected complication mid-mission and required immediate leadership to resolve it. He told Aldgate that all 11 candidates would participate. What he did not say, but what Aldgate understood, was that this was not a second chance for Linwood. It was a clarification. It was the board being given the opportunity to demonstrate whether their original assessment was based on what they had seen or on what they had decided to see before they saw anything at all. The scenario took place on a Thursday. The terrain was a series of low hills east of the post, with a designated objective 3 team members and an instructor playing the role of a communications failure at the worst possible moment. Each candidate was given 8 minutes to lead the team from the point of failure to the objective under the original mission parameters, adapted for the loss of communications. Dunmore went first. He performed well. He was forceful, clear, and he got the team to the objective with 2 minutes to spare. Fenn went third. He was methodical. The team arrived on time. Linwood went 8th. She was given the scenario brief. She read it. She asked one question: what was the last known position of the communications failure? The instructor told her. She nodded. She looked at the terrain for 11 seconds, not looking around. Looking at it, the way a person reads a text they are going to be tested on. Then she turned to the team. She didn't tell them what to do. She told them what she saw. We've lost comms at grid reference Delta 7. The original objective is here. There are two viable approaches. The northern route saves time, but puts us exposed on that ridge for 6 minutes. The southern route takes longer, but keeps us in cover the whole way. She paused. I want us alive at the objective, not early and visible. Southern route, let's move. The team moved. They reached the objective in 7 minutes and 40 seconds. Corbin was watching from the observation point. He was not a man who annotated his reactions visibly, but the instructor, standing beside him, said afterward that Corbin had written something in his notebook immediately after Linwood's team reached the objective. He had underlined it twice. The board reconvened the following week. The supplementary evaluation added a new data point to each candidate's subjective scores. Linwood's cumulative score placed her second in the cohort. Dunmore remained first. She was notified on a Thursday morning by email. She read the email once. Then she closed her laptop. Aldgate never spoke publicly about the process. He transferred to a staff position at Fort Leavenworth 8 months later, which was neither unusual nor extraordinary in the trajectory of a career like his. Fitch retired the following spring. Corbin, in a recommendation letter written 2 years after the course, described Petra Linwood as one of the most technically precise and tactically sound officers I have assessed in 23 years of evaluation work. He did not mention the original score. He did not need to. Dunmore found out about the formal inquiry through the same sideways channel that everything moved through. He found out about it 3 weeks after the board reconvened, sitting in the motor pool on a Tuesday afternoon, and he was quiet for a moment before he said anything. Then he said, "She filed a 2-page memo." Fenn said, "Yeah." Dunmore thought about it. 2 pages, that's all it took, Fenn said. Tolliver, who had been listening without contributing, said, "You know what the funny part is? She never once said they were wrong about her. She just asked them to show their work." Nobody had an answer to that. Linwood was assigned to a reconnaissance element attached to an advisory mission in the Pacific Command area of responsibility. The details of the assignment are not part of any open record. What is known is that she served for 3 consecutive tours in that role, that she was promoted ahead of her peer group on 2 separate occasions, and that at some point during her 3rd tour, she was asked to evaluate a candidate for the same advanced course she had completed. She reviewed the candidate's file. She sat in on the stalking exercise. She observed the command problem. When the board convened, she was asked to provide her assessment of the candidate's command presence. She took out her evaluation form. She looked at it for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me what you observed. Specifically, I'll write it down." There was a pause in the room. The other evaluators looked at each other. One of them said, "That's not usually how we—" I know, Linwood said. She held her pen. She waited. "But that's how we're doing it today." Nobody objected. They told her what they observed. She wrote it down. The scores that came out of that board were the most internally consistent the course had produced in a decade, which nobody made a formal note of at the time, but which the course administrator mentioned quietly to Harwick when Harwick asked how the cycle had gone. Harwick said, "Good." He did not elaborate. Outside the window of the room where he took that call, the afternoon light was doing the thing it does in October when the angle changes, coming in low and flat, catching the dust on the glass and turning it gold. He sat for a moment after he hung up the phone. He thought about Linwood the way you think about certain officers. Not with sentiment exactly, but with a kind of recognition. The recognition of a thing that had been true all along, that had required no discovery except the willingness to look. He picked up the next file on his desk. He looked at it. He showed his work.